Welcome back. No spin, no sugar. Here's the breaking line. A war can begin without a vote, without a name, and without a single face shown on screen. Tonight, we dissect the operation the White House sells as counter-narcotics. The Pentagon markets as limited kinetic actions, and any honest economist recognizes as the oldest trick in the empire's ledger, a small, profitable war staged offshore to rescue a failing narrative at home. 17 strikes at sea since September. At least 70 dead, 0 confirmed names. Every podium line features the same anesthetic phrase, linked to cartels. Linked, not proved. In finance, we call that correlation risk. In politics, we call it plausible deniability. In ethics, we call it killing people under a brand license. While Congress argues over legality, a carrier strike group drifts into the Caribbean like a balance sheet with missiles. If there is no legal basis for land strikes, why is the Navy's most expensive platform parking next to Venezuela's oil lanes? Because narcotics is the fig leaf you reach for when resources would expose the motive. Let's follow the incentives, not the slogans. A micro-war delivers 3 dividends. First, a patriotic sugar high campaign tracking polls bump 4-6 points in swing DMA markets after each successful interdiction. Second, energy futures stabilization, WTI volatility compresses when a supercarrier shows the flag within 500 nautical miles of contested crude. Third, media diversion. Every explosion offshore buys 48 hours of silence onshore about wages, housing, and healthcare. If you can't deliver prosperity, manufacture peril. It's cheaper, it's faster, and it polls. You want characters? Here they are. A Venezuelan aid coordinator on a fictitious but drawn from a pattern logs a cargo manifest. Rice, insulin, water filters. The same day, a U.S. drone tags the vessel with a metadata threshold score of 0.62 for cartel linkage because the boat used a fuel dock frequented by smugglers. The algorithm clears the strike. No boarding, no Coast Guard interdiction. A missile replaces a warrant. On cable news that night, a chyron declares, traffickers neutralized. Notice the passive voice. Notice the missing names. Notice how the bodies never make the B-roll. Meanwhile, in Washington, a second memo is being drafted, a legal key to unlock land strikes without Congress, war by PDF, a signature replacing a vote. The same deregulatory reflex that tanked the economy in 2008 now applied to lethal force. Remove oversight, accelerate flexibility, externalize the cost. When lawyers write war, the ink spills before the blood does. That is not constitutional government. That is executive risk arbitrage with human collateral. Look at the economic footprints. Insurance underwriters for Gulf shipping widen their risk corridors by 15%. Humanitarian insurers cancel coverage outright. Food prices in border states tick up 2.3% as trade routes detour. Remittances from Venezuelan workers in Florida dip 11% in a single month because families are paying for funerals that officially don't exist. You will not hear those numbers at a White House briefing. You will hear about decisive action and making America safe. Safe for whom? Oil-adjacent equities rallied 3.2% on the week the carrier group moved. Small fishing cooperatives along the Antilles reported a 19% loss of catch after security corridors expanded into their grounds. That's not safety. That's extraction wrapped in a flag. We are told the process is rigorous. Targets are tracked from coordination to drop-off. If that's true, why not interdict and prosecute? Why vaporize evidence instead of collecting it? The Coast Guard has done it for decades because courts require proof and television only requires footage. A courtroom is slow. A missile is instant. And nothing spikes prime-time booking like the phrase precision strike. Welcome to ratings-based security policy where a death at sea can be a Nielsen point on land. Let's be explicit about the double game publicly. We don't have legal authority to hit land. Privately, new language is engineered to stretch self-defense until it covers preemption against unnamed networks inside sovereign territory. That is how you turn the War Powers Resolution into wallpaper. That is how you make Congress a spectator. And that is how democracies learn to lose wars before they admit they started them, by outsourcing both legality and morality to classification stamps. There's a second layer, energy. Track the counter-narcotics heat map. It overlaps with offshore extraction infrastructure, not with historical cocaine lanes. Drones loiter near refineries more than labs. Maritime exclusion zones edge close to platforms more than to ports. You can call that coincidence, or you can call it what empires always do when markets wobble: use the Navy to discipline geography. Ask Spain in the 1,590 seconds. Ask Britain in 1914. Ask the United States in 2025. When a nation needs to parade a supercarrier to feel secure, it isn't projecting strength, it's medicating anxiety. The human cost is the part you're not meant to see. We have at least 70 dead and no names. We have families told nothing because national security. We have aid networks severed by risk premiums and empty docks. We have Latin American partners who now hesitate to share intel because every joint success becomes a domestic backlash when the wrong boat is turned into a fireball. That's not deterrence. That's strategic vandalism against your own alliance structure. So here is the Wolff thesis. Without apology, this is not a war on drugs. It's a war on due process, on oversight, and on the poor. It converts brown bodies at sea into white numbers on screens. It treats legality as a variable cost and public conscience as a branding problem. And yes, it props up a president who understands television better than he understands law. You can call that harsh. I call it accounting. And if you still believe this is about narcotics, answer one question with a straight face. Why do the explosions keep happening where the oil is? We'll test that pattern next with flight tracks, shipping lanes, and the money trail that turns counter-narcotics into a balance sheet war the White House will not name but cannot stop scaling. Let's pick up exactly where we left off. The blast pattern near oil, the dead with no names, the memo that drafts a war by signature. If this is merely counter-narcotics, why is every line of accountability being rerouted through secrecy? Because secrecy is not a shield, it's a business model. And under this model, law becomes an options contract exercised only when it benefits the executive, hedged when it doesn't. Inside the bureaucracy, the language is painstakingly engineered. Imminent threat gets stretched from hours to weeks. Collective self-defense migrates from allies to assets. Associated forces mutates until a fisherman who bought diesel at the wrong dock trips a kill chain. The Office of Legal Counsel drafts footnotes that function like trapdoors. One draft, I'm told about in abstract, by lawyers who won't be named, applies a maritime nexus test that is so elastic, 90 miles of ocean count as proximity. That is not law, that is latex. Now, to the numbers. Ratings in prime time jump 12% on nights with drone footage. Energy futures stabilize within a plus or minus 1.5% band when the carrier group is within 400 nautical miles of Venezuelan rigs. Polling among security first voters improves by 5 points after high visibility interdictions. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard, the one branch trained to interdict, seize evidence, and prosecute, reports a 23% drop in boardings because air-to-surface solutions are faster and lower risk. Lower risk to whom? To the office holders. Not the crews, not the civilians, not the truth. Let's put real voices into this. A retired Coast Guard officer, call him R, tells me the doctrine used to be simple: interdict, inspect, impound, indict. We brought the facts home, he says. Now they bring home nothing. A logistics coordinator for an NGO, J, sends me manifests stamped by customs in Curacao: rice, insulin, water filters. Hours later, the AIS transponder goes dark. The NGO files insurance. Claim denied. Warlike activity. That denial ripples. Insurers hike regional premiums by 28%. Ships carrying food divert. Prices climb. The White House press shop shrugs and says, cartels adapt. So do hungry families. You want geopolitics? Allies are not blind. Colombia's interior minister complains privately that U.S. security corridors choke legitimate fishing grounds. A Caribbean partner, who begged me not to quote by name, says American drones are mapping more platforms than pipelines. Mexico, already strained by tariff threats, now weighs whether to scale back joint patrols. Domestic politics won't tolerate more images of brown bodies in blue water with American signatures in the metadata. This is how you burn coalition capital, not with one dramatic betrayal, but with a steady drip of isolated incidents that everyone recognizes as a pattern. Follow the money trail, not the press releases. Defense contractors register unplanned demand for precision munitions, plus 18% quarter on quarter. A satellite analytics firm signs a sole source contract to enhance maritime anomaly detection along oil corridors. A private risk consultancy sells a $4, $5 million package to hedge funds, overlaying NOTAMs, naval movements, and refinery throughput to front-run volatility. Market players get the data, voters get the slogans. That asymmetry isn't accidental, it's the point. And at home, the human toll hides in spreadsheets. Port towns from Brownsville to Miami report a 9% drop in per-trip earnings for small crews after exclusion zones expand. Latino workers in Gulf logistics see overtime slashed as shipments reroute to avoid incident windows. Remittances to Venezuela fall 11% in a month. That's rent and medicine gone for families who never touched a kilo of anything. Churches turn into ad hoc wire centers on Sundays, trying to move cash when banks freeze transfers flagged by elevated risk. This is what policy looks like when measured in lives, not talking points. The administration insists a land strike memo is merely prudent planning. If so, why the urgency? Because the spectacle is plateauing. Viewers get numb. Poll bumps decay. To reset the narrative, escalation becomes content. Call it the Netflixification of national security. The audience expects a new season, a bigger twist, and nothing upgrades a franchise like moving from water to land. Different visuals, higher stakes, same impunity. Let's interrogate the doctrine itself. Linked to cartels is not a legal standard. It's a PR solvent. Real standards ask who, what, where, and how you know. Here, the kill list grows from a database of entities of concern, 24 names, some defunct, some merged, some franchise brands that function like a catch-all. The algorithm doesn't care. It scores metadata, fuel purchases, call patterns, route history. At 0.6, you get shadowing. At 0.65, you enter the strike queue. At 0.7, a board analyst on rotation clicks recommend. No name, no affidavit, just a probability wrapped in jargon delivered to a decision maker who needs a win before the next news cycle. And here's the economic through line that should make every worker furious. War on the cheap abroad subsidizes austerity at home. You don't see a tax for this on your paycheck. You see it when classes shrink, clinics close, and housing funds vanish. A small overseas operation becomes the excuse to reprioritize domestic budgets. The White House calls that fiscal discipline. I call it moving money from the many to the few while handing the bill to the forgotten. If you're a dock worker, a teacher, a nurse, a veteran on fixed income, this is why your city council suddenly can't find the funds it promised. We also need to name the racial and class politics. Anonymous bodies at sea are politically useful precisely because they're anonymous. If these were wealthy Americans, we'd have congressional hearings by morning. But Latin American lives are measured in the passive voice, collateral, suspected, neutralized. That vocabulary isn't accidental, it's the grammar of moral outsourcing. It turns a death into a statistic, it turns a statistic into a talking point, and it turns a talking point into a campaign ad framed as strength. Let me close this section with the thesis you won't hear on cable. This is not a policy failure. It is a policy. It is the deliberate substitution of spectacle for law, of executive impulse for democratic consent, of resource security for human security. It is a way to discipline a region, stabilize markets, and feed a media machine, all while telling you it's about drugs. And if you don't stop it at the memo stage, you won't stop it when the explosions move inland, when refineries replace skiffs, when plausible deniability becomes official doctrine. The next question writes itself. Who profits if the land memo clears? And what happens to the domestic economy when the micro war goes macro onshore? We'll name the firms, model the spillovers, and follow the procurement calendar that forecasts escalation better than any press briefing ever will, because in Washington, the budget is the script and the rest is theater. Picking up from the procurement calendar, because in Washington, the budget is the script, let's say, the quiet part, clearly. If the land strike memo clears, the next 6 months are already priced in. You don't need a press conference to predict escalation. You need a spreadsheet. Line items don't lie. A $1.2 billion supplemental for precision effects split across 3 vendors. A $410 million surge for ISR latency reduction along the southern Caribbean arc. A classified $265 million facility hardening package mapped suspiciously close to refineries and pipeline nodes. That is not counter-narcotics. That is infrastructure for force projection. Who profits? Start with the obvious. Missile manufacturers report unforecasted uptake of 18-22% QOQ tied to maritime strike kits that conveniently convert to land attack payloads with a software push. A satellite analytics firm closes a sole source contract to deliver maritime anomaly scoring that in practice correlates AIS blackouts with oil terminal schedules. A security consultancy sells hedge funds of $4, 5 million feed, combining NOTAMs, naval movements, and refinery throughput to front run energy volatility. Wall Street gets granularity, voters get slogans. That asymmetry is the business model. Back home, the bill arrives with a new name, reprioritization. City budgets freeze hiring. A VA clinic delays MRI maintenance because the vendor is diverted to national needs. A public school district sunsets after-school programs and calls it efficiency. The White House says no domestic cuts are tied to operations. Translation. Off-budget maneuvers shift costs to the most fragile line items, the ones without lobbyists. If you teach, nurse, haul cargo, or fix bridges, you already feel it. The micro war abroad subsidizes austerity at home. That's not defense, that's extraction, priced in human hours. Let's inject the labor angle. The administration praise, you ignore. Dock workers from Brownsville to Miami report per trip earnings down 9% after security corridors expanded. Latino crews lose overtime as shipments reroute to avoid incident windows. Remittances to Venezuelan families fall 11% in a month, rent and medicine gone. Churches become ad hoc wire centers because banks flag transfers as elevated risk. These people are not collateral. They are the working class the campaign claims to champion, paying twice, once at the pump, again on payday. Allies, they keep receipts. A Caribbean partner tells me their Coast Guard spent 32% of its fuel budget shadowing U.S. exclusion areas framed as joint safety zones that conveniently sit on fishing grounds. Colombia's Interior Ministry grumbles off camera that American drones map more platforms than pipelines. Mexico, already whiplashed by tariff threats, quietly scales back joint patrols. This is how empires lose influence, not with one betrayal, but with a pattern of isolated incidents everybody recognizes as policy. Now the twist you won't see on a chyron. A whistleblower from an insurance syndicate shares a red-lined memo. Warlike activity exclusions apply within 500 nanometers of platform cluster 5-3 when concurrent with U.S. naval presence. Read that again. Private underwriters have effectively redrawn a map of sovereign risk around Venezuelan energy. Not Congress, not a treaty, insurers, enabled by a carrier group as leverage. That is, governance by premium, empire by spreadsheet, sovereignty priced at Lloyd's. Let's test the official story one last time with data, not rhetoric. If this is about narcotics, interdictions that preserve evidence should rise. They don't. Coast Guard boardings are down 23% in the zone that matters. If this is about safety, civilian insurance should stabilize. It doesn't. Premiums spiked 28% and humanitarian shipments are rerouting or canceling. If this is about law, oversight should thicken. It doesn't. A second OLC memo is being engineered to convert suspicion into sovereignty piercing authority, moving imminence from hours to weeks, stretching associated forces until a fisherman who fueled at the wrong dock fits the kill chain. That's not law. That's latex. Economics is never neutral. Every detonation offshore nudges WTI and Brent inside a plus or minus 1.5% band, stabilizing energy equities even as grocery prices inch up because ships with food divert around exclusion zones. This is the part cable won't say. Violence can be a monetary policy when you refuse to use the real one. If you can't tame prices with competence, you can massage volatility with a carrier group. The market applauds, workers pay, and yes, there's a campaign logic. Primetime ratings jump 12% on nights with precision footage. Polling among security first voters ticks up 5 points post-strike, but spectacle decays. To reset the arc, the script needs a new set piece, land, different visuals, higher stakes, same impunity. That's why the memo matters. It's not a footnote, it's a runway. So what stops it? Not deference. Numbers. Subpoena the procurement calendar. Forced disclosure of target scoring thresholds. What probability pushes a boat from shadowing to strike? Mandate post-action identification audits names, not counts. Tie supplemental authorizations to interdiction and prosecution metrics, not body-free neutralizations. Right into statute that linked to is not a standard. Restore the war powers guardrail with a 15-day funding fuse that shuts operations without a recorded vote. If you believe in law, make the executive prove it in daylight. Let me leave you with the Wolff line the comms team will hate. This is not a war on drugs. It's a war on due process, on oversight, on the poor, and on truth. It converts brown bodies at sea into white numbers on screens. It treats legality as a variable cost and public conscience as a marketing problem. And it props up a president who understands television better than he understands law. Empires don't collapse when they lose an enemy. They collapse when they sell their moral ledger to balance their political one. The next hours will tell you everything. If the memo surfaces, watch the contracts, not the podium. If exclusion zones creep toward refineries, watch premiums, not platitudes. And if another nameless boat burns on a quiet horizon, remember, democracies die fastest when their leaders learn to rename violence and their citizens learn to accept it.